Hello and welcome to the Hoop Collective podcast. We talk about the NBA, which we are doing on Sunday evening. Joining me from New York City is Tim Bontemps.
Hello, everybody.
And celebrating the first day of NBA free agency and the first day of the league year 2024-25 in Dallas, Texas is Ben MacMahon.
Howdy, partners. The power here was out for much of the first couple hours of free agency. I thought that was kind of a fitting metaphor for the way they actually started.
Yeah, you know, the new rules slow down transactions. I think you will continue to see transactions slowed down in the future, at least for the next year or two while people get used to this. I know that's not what people want. People love the hot stove this time of year, but it's not to be. Plus, teams can now negotiate with their own free agents in after the finals. So we had 2 weeks of a few deals that would have normally popped up immediately that got drawn out. So it's not the crackling system that it used to be. And that's what it is. The biggest name, though, is Paul George. By the time this podcast is on television and online, we may have Paul George being finalized going to the 76ers. As of right now, all we can say is that all signs point to that. It's not so much Paul George choosing the 76ers as it is Paul George sort of being limited to the 76ers, because at the end of the day, he and the Clippers were off. They just decided they weren't going to do business together anymore, which we'll talk about more in depth in a minute. The Clippers put out a statement. It was fortunately very professional and not in any sort of venom as we've seen in the past.
Or in Comic Sans.
Not in Comic Sans. It was in regular professional font. But at the end of it, Paul George was not going to a team like the Wizards or a team like the Pistons that had cap space. He was only looking at the end of the day at the Orlando Magic and Philadelphia 76ers. The Clippers attempted to do trades where he would opt into his contract over the weekend and be traded, but they really couldn't get anywhere there because one of the biggest reason why the Clippers didn't really want Paul George anymore was because they didn't want him on their books, because having him on their books pushed them into the so-called second apron, put a whole bunch of handcuffs on their way to build their team, construct their roster, and they basically decided that they were better off without Paul George than they were having him on the team. And if you traded Paul George and took back salary, you'd be in the same boat. You'd have the same restrictions, except for you wouldn't have as good of a player. So teams like the Golden State Warriors, who are very interested in trading for Paul George and then extending him, really couldn't get anywhere with the Clippers at the end of the day. They made, from what I understand, a bunch of different offers, were willing to offer a future unprotected first-round pick, but the Clippers weren't down with it. So at the end of the day, I'm not so sure that it's the 76ers winning the sweepstakes for Paul George, Bontemps, as much as it is Paul George was limited to the 76ers as his option, especially after the Magic, despite having a meeting scheduled with Paul George, went ahead and used their salary cap space on Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, at least a lot of it, Caldwell-Pope, at least a lot of it. So obviously it's going to be a big moment if the Sixers can go ahead and close the deal. But at the end of the day, they were sort of standing alone with Paul George as his option.
I mean, I think you're pretty wildly underrating and underplaying the fact that the Sixers now have the best big three in the league by a pretty significant amount. But I also think
three in the league.
It's not even close. I also would say that.
But you do agree that there was not like there was five options. He had one option.
No, I mean, the Sixers have been planning to do this for a year. They've been planning to have max cap space to put a star with Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. And we've talked a lot about how they had to get a star, and they have hit a grand slam. They got Paul George on their team. They have a chance. Oh, go ahead.
We think they hit a grand slam. The ball hadn't cleared the fence yet.
All right. I feel pretty confident that by the time people are listening to this, it's either done or virtually done. For all the reasons we just talked about. He met with three teams. One of them spent a ton of money on Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. The other announced he's signing with another team. So I think
you're making my point.
Well, I am to a point. I do think you are not exactly presenting the Clippers situation correctly, because what I would say with what they did was they played a game of chicken with Paul George and lost. They said they clearly decided their team was not good enough to win a title as constructed. So they said, Paul, we're going to offer you basically the same deal we offered Kawhi Leonard, who from the moment he signed that deal, there's a reason why you want to talk about it immediately, Brian, back in the spring, right? Kawhi Leonard signed this extension for less than max dollars and less than max years. That was a bombshell moment when he did that. And the moment he signed that extension, it put this Paul George situation into focus because it was going to always be difficult for the Clippers to keep Paul George when they were going to hew to, hey, we got Kawhi to take this deal, so we're not giving you more than this. And other teams like the Sixers were going to walk in and say, hey, man, we're going to give you everything you want. We're going to give you 4 years. We're going to give you $212 million. We're going to say, hey, come here, take all the money, and let's try to win a title. So the Clippers clearly didn't believe in their team enough to go into the second apron. I think if they thought they had a championship caliber team, they would say, yeah, we'll spend the money. We'll do this stuff. We'll figure the rest out later. They clearly didn't. So they tried signing trades.
I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that's true.
Because I think that's 100% true. Because if they felt that way, they would have done it.
That's what they're saying in their statement. But they did offer Paul George $50 million. It wasn't like they offered him, right, 30.
But if they had offered Paul George, if Paul George had agreed to that extension, the Clippers still wouldn't have been in the second apron this year. There are plenty of ways they could have got around being in the second apron, and they could have had him on the team and then negotiated stuff around it going forward.
Well, I would argue then, why didn't they do that?
Because Paul George didn't want to sign a 3-year deal for less than max dollars. That's why.
It came to, and look, who can blame him? Like, he's going to make whatever it is, 50 some odd million in year 4. That's a lot of money to leave on the table. And, you can say, hey, his options were limited at the end, but the option of Philadelphia does give him a chance to go to a contender that hasn't broken through and hasn't been to the conference finals. Obviously, the Clippers only had the one time, but it's not like he's taken some kind of step back. And you might say,
I agree. It was a good option, but it was a single option.
Yeah, but you knew the whole time, or he knew the whole time that option was out there. And look, Daryl Morey absolutely needed this to happen, because you can't go with, hey, we're going to have all this cap space, we're going to swing and get another star in here, and then strike out and look Joel Embiid in the eye and be like, just be patient. Just be patient. No, Daryl Morey needed this to happen, and it ended up happening.
Well, and that's why we got to. That's why we got to talk about the Sixers, because to your point, MacMahon, we go back to last summer. The James Harden thing happens. That's a whole mess, right? Looks like, man, what's going on with the Sixers? You got all the fallout from the Morey and Harden relationship. You're going, man, where is this going to land? They make this trade midseason with the Clippers. They get a decent return back for him, but it's all based around future draft picks and expiring money. It was all geared toward making sure they could make a big splash this summer. It's why we said all year they have to make a big splash this summer. And they went out and they got the number 1 free agent by a country mile to sign with them. They do clearly have the best big 3 in the league. I think they are clearly now the biggest challengers to Boston in the East. Now, you could say there's a lot of health question marks.
They've only got like 5 players.
Well, I'll start with 3 all-stars who play at a lead guard.
Okay, I agree. Let me ask you this. Why did the Clippers not work?
I mean, I would say largely because of health and some
good
luck.
Answer.
And that's going to be, obviously, that's a huge concern.
Sure.
With an Embiid, Paul George pairing.
There's only been one star player who's been more injured in the playoffs the last 3 or 4 years than Joel Embiid, and it's Kawhi Leonard, or vice versa.
Well, but again, like you could sit. I mean, to me, it's kind of insane to sit here right now when the Sixers just landed the one true difference-making player in the market this summer and go, man, the Sixers are kind of screwed. Like, it's
no, I agree. I agree that it's a great fit for the Sixers and it's a great fit for Paul George. Like when you consider what they were looking at, there was only one max player that the Sixers could hope to get. And there was only one place that had a max contract offer that Paul George would even be would even fit at all. They definitely found each other, and it's a good job by the two of them to find each other. But I'm not sure that this is all of a sudden going to be the biggest contender in the East of the Celtics. They haven't built this roster out.
Well,
They've got to prove that.
That's fair.
They have three. They have one of the best 5 players in the league when he's healthy. They've got another guy who's an all-NBA forward, and everybody's looking for two-way wings. And they've got one of the best young guards in the league who's only getting better, and they all made the All-Star team last year.
They're starting to, like an Eric Gordon addition, an Andre Drummond as your backup 5. They've still got some cap space to play with.
Yeah.
Bontemps, what's the number they'll have if
they'll have around
14 mil?
Yeah, they basically has, it depends, because you could do some different things with the Andre Drummond contract. You could put it into space, you could use the room exception, but if they have around, I think, the mid-level, it's not actually the mid-level, but it's like $13-14 million in space to potentially add another impact player or two.
I mean, they are one of the teams that's going to be that's having discussions with Klay. I don't love their odds to land him, but with 14 mil or so, they'll land somebody.
Yeah.
There was some talk earlier in the day about them potentially pulling off a Paul George KCP double play, which would have been phenomenal.
Kentavious Caldwell-Pope is who you mean, just in case anybody doesn't know who KCP is.
Which we need to talk about him in a little bit too, because
we will. Yeah, I promise. I do agree that they are. It was actually, I believe you said this to me the other day on the phone, Bontemps, or maybe you said it on the pod. I can't remember. This is actually, first off, part of the reason why the CBA is got the mechanisms in it is to limit heavy spending. That's also to redistribute talent a little bit. And that functionally is what happened here. The Clippers were largely driven to this decision by the new CBA, and talent was redistributed to the East. And so if you look at this last 5-6 days, the East was Boston and everybody else. And the improvements that the Knicks and the Sixers have made just in this last week create a very compelling Northeast for the Bontemps zone there, MacMahon. Bontemps.
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, look, the CBA rules were put in place to stop the Clippers and to stop Steve Ballmer. That's what they were put in place to do, and they have succeeded. Like, if the Clippers, it's Lawrence Frank himself said it the other day, that under the old system, it was carte blanche. They could do what they wanted. They would not be losing Paul George over money. They would not be losing anybody over money. They would spend what it took. They'd probably be combining salaries to go add other players on the market. Like, they'd be loading up to make another run. But because of the new rules, that's where they had to decide, okay, like, yeah, we could just spend this money, but are we really good enough to make it worth spending that money over a longer period of time? And like, the results speak for themselves. They're not a championship caliber team. They lost in the first round of the playoffs. Yes, Kawhi was hurt, but to your point before, Brian, Kawhi's been hurt a lot. And look, the Sixers obviously have some risk here. But again, I think we are very much poo-pooing the idea that the Sixers just landed a top 15 player in the league.
I don't mean to, you're right. I don't mean to poo-poo it. I definitely recognize
every other word you're saying is but.
Well, it's
a huge moment for the Sixers. This is not what anybody. Let's be
honest.
Agree. We didn't think all season, right? Nobody really thought all season the Sixers were landing a max level player, right? None of us.
No, come on. No, the whole.
No, did we hold on? Player. Would we have bet? No, I'm not saying they weren't going to try to. I'm saying, did we really believe? I didn't believe they were necessarily going to get a max player. Like, I didn't think that Paul George was going to wind up on this team.
A week ago, I thought at the end of the day, he's going to want to stay in LA. That, he'll ultimately at the end of the day, he'll take this contract.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. Like, this is for them to execute this high wire strategy where all year it was, well, are they going to actually pull this off, or are they going to be stuck with a bunch of leftovers at the dinner table? And they got the guy on the market.
You're right. I'm more reacting to the mechanics of the moment here. these two entities that were sort of left out in the wilderness, as I am to where things are going to be in 6 months.
Wendy,
Sure.
when the USWB is telling you to pep up and stop being such
I guess so. I guess so.
downer, my goodness.
I'm talking more about the transaction itself than the actual
Sure.
team
I
that's
know. I'm
becoming.
just pointing it out.
Yeah,
By
to
the
me,
way,
this
all these hard cappings and this new CBA is making it tough on the Knicks too. Like they might lose Isaiah Hartenstein because of that. Now we'll see what the final deal looks like, if they are actually the final deal for Bridges looks like, if they can avoid the hard cap. But if they are, then he sounds like he's going Oklahoma City, Orlando, somewhere else that can give him market value, which is going to be a significant chunk of change.
That's
I
exactly
feel like
what they were trying to do.
I feel like the way this offseason is shaping up here, it's really a story of the I-95 corridor and a story of the I-5 corridor. So obviously you see the Celtics are the champs. The Knicks have powered up with Mikal Bridges and re-signed OG Anunoby. Obviously, the Sixers make the biggest move in free agency. And then you look at these three teams out here where I'm at in LA on the West Coast. The Lakers are trying to figure out a way to upgrade their roster. The Clippers are essentially waving the white flag isn't accurate because they have Kawhi Leonard and they re-signed James Harden. And they're still trying to add pieces. Just before we started the podcast, it's been reported that they're going to take Derek Jones out of Dallas, which is another story. But you've got the Clippers sort of really letting go of the mantle of being this high spending team and retrofitting and potentially taking a step back. And then you've got the Warriors. I don't know if I would say that the Warriors were the biggest loser, but I definitely think that the Warriors have come to terms with a new reality, kind of like the Clippers. So the Warriors, from what I understand, I said earlier, really tried hard to figure out a Paul George trade. And they're trying hard on some other things, and we'll see what they can maybe get accomplished in the next 24 to 48 hours. But they were unable to get a Paul George deal done. Extended Chris Paul's contract guarantee date from last Friday to Sunday evening, trying to find a trade that would make sense for Chris Paul, and eventually let him go, waived him with his $30 million contract, lost that trade chip. And Klay Thompson has pretty much informed them that he is moving on. And as we are doing this podcast, they're negotiating possible sign and trades where they could maybe retain some sort of asset for Klay Thompson. But those are three doors that they were kind of excited about that ended up closing without the team significantly improving itself. And coming off of a season where they missed the playoffs, it's not the kind of offseason that you would expect from them or that we've gotten used to from them. They're still trying some other stuff. I think Lauri Markkanen from the Jazz is available on the trade market. They're definitely investigating that. Whether or not they can make that work or not, is to be seen. But when you look at the Clippers stepping back, the Warriors stepping back, and the Lakers thrashing around a little bit, MacMahon, it is a bit of a different story than we're used to seeing with these teams.
And honestly, it's an especially depressing situation for the Warriors because it's not just about losing a guy who is, was a 39% three-point shooter and averaged 18 points a game. This is the end of an era with them losing Klay Thompson. And it is a bitter pill to swallow when you have a guy who's going to have a statue outside the arena, but the divorce from the franchise is, I don't know, uncomfortable to say the least. There's some hard feelings. It's just such a bummer of an ending for Klay Thompson. And like you said, it's not like they've got an easy path to replace the production. It's not, and this is a team that doesn't just need to replace the production. This is a team that needs to get better. And so you're looking at what's the twilight of Steph Curry, who's still playing at an elite level? Well, what's that look like? How do the Warriors, kind of get back in a position where one of the all-time great players in the history of the game has a chance to contend for another championship? Or, hey, maybe that's just come and gone, and enjoy Steph while it lasts. But as far as, you got 4 championships out of the deal and there won't be another one coming. I think, that's obviously the more likely scenario.
I mean, look, there's so many parallels to 12 years ago when Ray Allen left the Celtics and went to the Miami Heat. It's the exact same thing. Ray Allen, one of the great 3-point shooters of all time, Hall of Fame shooting guard, part of a big three, frustrated on a variety of levels with what was going on with his team, decides to leave for a rival team, acrimonious circumstances. That took a solid decade to clear up. I don't think the Klay one will take as long, but this is sort of inevitably how these things go sometimes.
The one thing I would say, though, is there's a lot more emotional equity in Klay.
For sure.
13 years drafted and developed by the Warriors, as opposed to Ray, who, came in. His was more of a mercenary situation. All the other parallels, you're right on Monday.
Yeah, it's not exactly the same, and I also think it's why it's a little more acrimonious, even maybe because of the amount of history there. But this is the kind of stuff that happens. And look, it's been a rough few years for Klay in general, right? He misses 2.5 years with injuries. He comes back and is playing, frankly, at a much higher level than I would have guessed for a guy who tore his ACL and tore his Achilles. I mean, he was 4th, I think, in the league in threes made last year. He shot 38 or 39% on 9 attempts a game. He is not the same level defender that he used to be, but he's still a potent offensive weapon who is going to be double teamed whenever he's on the court. And if he does wind up where you're at, MacMahon, like having him catching passes from Luka Doncic, setting him up for open shots, like he's going to be a really useful weapon for them going forward. And it's going to be a loss for Golden State. And it is, I think, a recognition on all sides that it was probably the right time for him to move on, given everything that's gone on with the Warriors, and for sort of everybody to start fresh. But, whether they try to go after Markkanen or they do something else, like the biggest thing I think to point to is this is a team that was 9th in the West last year, has lost Chris Paul, who is still a decent player, though he wasn't worth his contract, has now likely lost Klay Thompson, who was also a good player, but not worth his contract. And there's not anything immediately coming in the door to replace him. And like right now, if you're just looking at it, the Warriors should make the playoffs next year. Like that's just the reality of it. They're probably going to be on the outside looking in.
Yeah.
What if they're able to pull off Markkanen? Would you change your mind?
I mean, obviously, if they could get a guy like Markkanen, that would help certainly quite a bit. Because he is
depends on what
dynamic
what
player.
they're trading for him. I mean,
right, and it depends on what their roster looks like after. But certainly, if you had a guy like Lauri Markkanen, who's a big movement shooter, who's improved on defense, like that would be a really good piece. But again, like that's a big swing. Like maybe they could pull that off, but that's a really big swing.
There's some other teams that are looking at Markkanen. I think San Antonio is one of them.
I was going to say that to me would be a much more intriguing situation for Markkanen because of the way he would perfectly complement Wemby, and just the Spurs are loaded up on picks, can still have cap space, or they have easy ways to make the money match. That would be one heck of an addition if the Spurs want to be aggressive.
Well,
and it will like Markkanen's not going to be traded for any sort of discounts, just to be clear. Like it's going to be a heck of a package.
Yeah, but the teams who are negotiating with the Jazz do think there's a good chance they're going to move him, because sometimes Danny Ainge, as Bontemps has detailed over the years when he was with the Celtics, will act like he's going to do a trade and then there's no trade.
Right.
And maybe that'll happen again here, but the teams negotiating think so. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, what he's not going to do, to MacMahon's point, he ain't selling him for a discount if he trades him. He doesn't lose trades very often. He's one of the best at it for a reason. Now, we have talked about Markkanen going back for a year now for a couple of reasons, right? One is he's going into the final year of his deal. He's making $18 million, obviously below what his production has been since going to Utah, playing under Will Hardy, who's turned him into an all-star caliber player. you got to decide if you're Utah, are you going to extend him and give him a huge raise? Or are you going to move on from him and sort of fully pivot into this rebuild? And when you look at this 2025 draft, and as loaded as it is, and frankly, as good of a job as Will Hardy has done the last couple of years, where they've had to sort of backslide their way into the back half of the back half of the top 10 down the stretch because of how well they've played early in the year. This is the time to trade Lauri Markkanen, to cash in on him, and then fully move into this rebuilding era where you've got Keontae George and Taylor Hendricks and these other young guys that they've got, and fully flip this thing over. And Markkanen could give you a whole bunch more stuff to do that. And he also doesn't make sense with the timeline they're on. So yeah, like it makes sense to trade him now. The thing I'm curious about is in the wake of the Mikal Bridges trade, is there going to be a good enough price out there where Danny Ainge feels good about making this trade? Because like the Knicks, as we talked about, really overpaid in draft capital for Mikal Bridges. And so Markkanen's similar kind of player. Ainge is going to want a similar kind of return. That's 5 first-round picks is a lot of first-round picks.
And San Antonio, if they chose to be that aggressive, has the assets to do it. And what San Antonio did with Chris Paul, they on a 1-year basis, they have solved their point guard void, right? And they also kept their powder dry as opposed to going out and doing like a Trae Young deal where you're giving up significant draft capital and taking on a massive contract. This keeps their powder dry. We'll see if Stephon Castle's a guy who's ready to be a starting point guard, as soon as next season. Obviously, they liked him enough to take him with the 4th overall pick. I think Trey Jones has a chance to be a great long-term backup, but clearly he needed to be a backup. But they still have the Atlanta picks moving forward. They still have a Chicago pick. They've got some some other picks plus all of their own. Like if they want to take a huge swing, they've got the ammo to do it.
Well, they've also got a couple of Minnesota picks, and Utah's already got most of the rest of Minnesota's picks.
That's
it's sort of a funny thing from the Rob Dillingham trade the other day.
That's true. All right, so we'll see what happens with Markkanen, if anything at all. But go back to Klay Thompson real quick. Look, Klay bet on himself to a certain extent. He was probably a little bit annoyed he had to bet on himself. He turned down a 2-year extension for $48 million before last season. It was the same summer that Draymond Green got 4 years at $100 million. We don't need to go over that old ground. He then he had a good season, but not a great season, and he lost his starting job for a stretch, and he didn't finish some games. And Brandon Pajemski really, their first-round draft pick, really blossomed. And so all of those things were contributing factors. What I think is interesting here is what Klay's choices are. So he was going to meet with 4 teams, the Mavericks, the 76ers, the Lakers, and the Clippers. I'm not putting anything past Daryl Morey. It would kind of, if it's straight about money, they're going to be a little bit behind what the Mavericks can offer. Maybe not a ton, but they can be behind. But that's obviously a very compelling team to join. I think the interesting thing is, I think Klay's going to want to start on the other side of this. And
the Mavericks are prepared to, like, they're recruiting him to start. They're not. They understand. Like, there's an understanding. Hey, this is an extremely proud guy who took it on the chin last year when he was asked midseason to move to the bench. And so, if he does end up in Dallas, I think the question becomes, is he closing games more than is he starting games? He did.
That's true.
And are we sure, by the way, are we sure that he's going to be closing games?
Oh, no. That's why I said I think that's the question.
I have no idea.
But I don't think that you are in a recruiting situation trying to convince a guy like Klay Thompson to come here. I know, like they're telling him, hey, you come here and you're starting next to Luka and Kyrie, and it's a different style of basketball, obviously. But if you're playing with Luka Doncic and he's running pick and roll with Derek Lively and and Daniel Gafford, like there will be plenty of good, clean catch and shoot opportunities for Klay Thompson.
Well, and the other thing too is that if it's a lot different, say coming off the bench or not closing games, if you're in Dallas than if you're in Golden State where you've played your whole career and you are going to have a statue outside the building and there is all this history, right? It's a lot different when you say, like Ray Allen went to Miami and came off the bench. I'm not saying Klay's coming off the bench, but it's just a much different thing when you're walking in with a clean slate somewhere new instead of building off of all of the history you've got in a place. And then it feels a lot more dramatic to make a decision like that.
Well,
in
and
a place like that.
The pressure is
Right.
drastically reduced. Obviously, the Mavericks have aspirations to contend for a championship, but it's not the place where he's won 4 championships.
Right.
You know, there's as much as Luka puts a spotlight on the Mavericks and they're coming off the finals berth, it's not the same as the spotlights that is on a team that has been the dynasty of this generation. And frankly, it's not the same as playing in Los Angeles with LeBron James.
Okay, so Philly has an interesting. They've got a little bit of space left, assuming they close the Paul George deal. They can offer Klay. Dallas is in a good spot when it comes to Klay because last week they did a salary dump deal, sending Tim Hardaway. They actually haven't done the deal yet, but they agreed to send Tim Hardaway to Detroit. That got what was his salary number, MacMahon?
16 and change.
$16 million off of their books. And it also created a trade exception, which is like a gift certificate. And that can be used to acquire Klay Thompson in a sign-and trade. And the reason that is attractive is that the Golden State Warriors have aspirations of doing other stuff with their roster, such as Larry Markkinen.
Mm-hmm.
They would not have to take any pieces back.
The Mavs would have to move a piece out. Very, very likely to be Josh Green, why
would they have to do that?
Because of the first apron. Because they're hard capped at the first apron and just where they are, giving Najee Marshall a chunk.
Oh, that's right. Najee Marshall. I forgot about that. They did a separate deal.
They signed Najee Marshall 3 years, $27 million. And essentially, if they move Josh Green, which a rebuilding team with cap space, he would be a nice addition to them as a take him for nothing type of guy. I don't think they'll have any issues moving him. But then they can go ahead and use the
Okay, I forgot about Najee Marshall. Najee Marshall is essentially their replacement for Derek Jones, who went to the Clippers.
Correct.
The Derek Jones signing, by the way, by the Clippers makes it harder for the Clippers to really get in on Klay Thompson. They could still do it, but it would take a sign and trade in all likelihood. And that's just very complicated, especially after the Clippers and Warriors negotiated for days on a Paul George trade and couldn't find a pairing. Now you'd have to ask them to go back over old ground to negotiate to send Klay Thompson there. It could happen, but it's harder. And the fact that the Clippers went ahead and used their mid-level exception, which they could have offered Klay Thompson, is an indication that they're not banking all their hopes on it. But the fact that the Tim Hardaway deal has already been made is a huge factor in the Klay Thompson situation as we sit here and talk about it. And that's where I want to talk about the Lakers. It was very interesting. I think we talked about it in the past in the pod. I certainly talked about it on TV last week that LeBron had indicated, even before the Lakers drafted Bronny James, that he might be willing to take a pay cut from his $51 million salary that he opted out of to create the opportunity for the Lakers to use their mid-level of $12 million, $13 million. And to do that, he's going to have to reduce his salary down quite a bit. Now, LeBron and Rich Paul met with the Lakers on this topic last week, and they agreed, from what I am told, on a short list of players that LeBron would feel good about taking less money to get on the Lakers. And obviously one of them was Klay Thompson. And
MacMahon reported 3. 1, James Harden's agreed to go back to the Clippers. Jonas Valanciunas, which surprised me a bit, has agreed to a deal with the Wizards, and Klay Thompson was the 3rd.
I think there's more than 3. I think DeMar DeRozan is on that list as well, and there may be another one or so. But here's the point: is
they're running out quick.
Yeah,
they don't have those players to sign, and to even get LeBron to right now it would take LeBron taking a 50% pay cut, 50, about $25 million less to get the Lakers in position to do that. Over the course of multiple years, that would potentially be a lot of money. So the Lakers are, under some level of pressure to make a separate deal to clear some more space. And that most likely would involve D'Angelo Russell, could involve a player like Gabe Vincent, could involve a player like Rui Hachimura, but probably is Russell because he is on the final year of his contract for 18 and change, almost 19 million. And that's basically kind of what the Mavericks have already done. The Mavericks have already done their cash dump. The Lakers haven't yet. And so I wouldn't rule it out, but I'm not sure. Then the Lakers did something interesting, Bontemps, on Sunday. They went ahead and signed Max Christie, their, former, was he a second round pick or was he a free agent?
Second round pick.
Second round pick. He was a restricted free agent. They signed him to a 4-year, $32 million deal, adding money to their payroll and making LeBron's pay cut for Klay Thompson much bigger. And this is
not really though, because if they were going to keep him, they extended a qualifying offer to him, and they planned to keep him, and so they always were going to have to factor that into whatever they were going to be under the hard cap.
The qualifying offer wasn't $8 million.
No, but I'm saying it's coming out of, I guess it's coming out of the same pool of money, but it goes back to the same point where this only ever really made sense if you trade D'Angelo Russell. If you trade D'Angelo Russell, they have they have the.
We don't need to go into the machinations further than that.
Right.
And they need to trade Russell. They haven't traded Russell yet. And
that's
they'd have to do that before they could really go for Klay Thompson.
And we talked about the Mavs have to do a second cost-cutting move to make this work now. But Josh Green at 3 years, I think it's 3 years, $41 million is a 23-year-old, developing player, I think is easier to dump than D'Angelo Russell with $18 million, where a rebuilding team, you don't want to bring D'Angelo Russell in unless it's incentivized. Where a rebuilding team might look at Josh Green and say, hey, first round pick has shown some promise, 23 years old, reasonable contract. Great. So I think it is a more difficult dump.
Yeah, I just think the Lakers are kind of farther away than the Mavericks are. And were we sure Klay would start with the Lakers if they dumped D'Angelo Russell and signed him?
Well,
I think he would.
I would say if they don't make him that promise, then I don't think there'll be a very long conversation.
Yeah, they would start LeBron, Davis, Reeves, Klay, and I don't know, probably Rui, I would guess.
Yeah.
That'd probably be their starting five.
I think they might start Gabe Vincent. I don't know.
Sure. I would probably start Gabe Vincent if he's healthy at the one, and then the other four guys.
Again, if you're recruiting Klay Thompson now, I think you need to tell him, hey, you're coming in to start, or
right.
I mean, honestly, at this point, I also think the Lakers, I understand because where we work, there's all this talk about LeBron taking a pay cut, and therefore we are going to spend 1,000 hours talking about the Lakers not doing anything while all this other stuff is happening. However, I would say at this point, the Lakers are just better off re-signing LeBron, keeping D'Angelo Russell, and using their draft picks and their salary later to trade for somebody or somebodies rather than doing a bunch of machinations to sign somebody to the mid-level now. Anyway.
I would agree. Or if there's a possibility that you could use Russell as basically an expiring contract, where you could take on some salary and acquire a piece that makes sense for you, not just in a straight cash dump. Maybe that's a way to go.
And look, if you're talking about Klay's decision, again, I don't want to totally rule out the 76ers. I think they can make an attractive offer, but money, I think the Mavericks will be higher. And certainly when you factor in the difference in no state income tax in Texas.
Well, that's true.
I think there's less pressure in Dallas. I mean, if you talk about star power that you're playing with, that's even to the edge in Dallas's favor. I think you could argue. How appealing would it be for Klay to play for essentially his hometown team? A place where he owns a home. His dad played, won championships with the Lakers. Calls games on the radio crew. Maybe that stuff does factor in, but I think in terms of, like I said, the ability to contend, the money, the less pressure, I think all of those are in Dallas's favor.
Yeah, the Mavs are a much better team and a much better fit. The Mavs just were in the finals. Like, the Lakers lost in the first round and it wasn't that competitive. Like, it's not even a debate. Like, if Klay's trying to go to the best situation for him, Dallas is unquestionably the better fit all the way around.
Yeah. Well, I just think when Rob Pelinka had that press conference when he hired JJ Redick, they didn't even imply, they flat out said, we're going to lean into development of young players. We're going to lean into trying to reformat the way we do business to help improve what we've got in-house. And we're really going to avoid trading our future draft picks if we can, unless it's like a home run deal.
Mm-hmm.
And with all due respect to Klay Thompson, I'm not sure that qualifies, and they may need to use a draft pick to with Russell if it's a straight cash dump. So I know that LeBron is trying to do his best here to help the cause, but what they're looking for, what LeBron is trying to push them towards, flies in the face of exactly what they stated their intention is the opposite. And not trading their draft pick in the draft last week and drafting Dalton Connect and signing Max Christie to a $32 million deal, these are actions that indicate they want to stick with that plan. So
I would say plans are fluid. I mean,
well,
it's also, I mean, look, again, because we don't have rational conversations about the Lakers at our network, let's just be rational about the Lakers. The Lakers are not very good. They are not a team that's anywhere near being a championship caliber team. Throwing good assets after bad at this point in a rush to try to make this team championship caliber today is not very prudent. Like, their best long-term bet is to have Max Christie become a starting level player, is to turn Dalton Connect into a player, is to not send first-round picks out the door to salary dump D'Angelo Russell to sign some 35-year-old player on a full mid-level deal. Like, none of those things, those are all things you do if you really have a chance to do something. Like, all these things we're talking about is for the Lakers to make the playoffs.
And no, Klay at this point's a finishing piece. He's not a foundation piece.
Yeah,
Very
like,
well
they're
said.
just not. This team is just not very good. It's just not.
So there was a significant trade a couple of days ago that we haven't got a chance to talk about yet, and that's the Atlanta Hawks sending Dejounte Murray to the New Orleans Pelicans for 2 future first-round picks, Larry Nance Jr. and Dyson Daniels. This is a trade that accomplishes 2 things. One, it breaks up Dejounte Murray and Trae Young, which was inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And it brings in some perimeter talent to New Orleans that gives them a little bit more freedom to trade Brandon Ingram. Ingram has not been headed in the right direction with the Pelicans for the last season, and he's extension eligible, and I don't think that's happening there. So it clears the way for a trade for Ingram later, and it also gets the Hawks, who are they're not really in a full rebuild yet because they don't control their draft. San Antonio does, but it returns some draft capital that they sent out when they got Dejounte Murray.
The Hawks admitted their mistake, right?
Yeah.
They got back not the full value of what they gave up to get him, but they got back some of the value that they gave up to get him. And like you said, they kind of have chosen a direction, and it tells you like there wasn't a great market for Trae Young, so they made the best deal that was available. But the Pelicans are the team that I think has a chance to make a splash next season. But like you said, this trade sets up, okay, what's your next trade? And when they trade Brandon Ingram, they've got to solve their question of, hey, who's playing center here? Because it had been Jonas Valanciunas. I think they want to get a more athletic player at that spot.
Better defender.
Yeah, and and starting Zion at center is not an acceptable option. So that's the big question the Pelicans are working on answering.
Well, look, they've got him and they've got CJ McCollum, right? Who they gave a not a good extension to a couple of years ago. That he's still got 2 years at big money, and they've got to maneuver some stuff around. But look, you've got Herb Jones, you've got Trey Murphy, now you've got Dejounte Murray, you've got Zion. That in theory should be your 1 to 4 spots going forward. If you can find a center to put with them, that's a group. All those guys are all in their mid-20s. That's a group that should, be able to be together for a while. It's a pretty interesting mix to go forward with and see. And look, Brandon Ingram is like a lot of these guys that we've sort of been talking about as potential trade guys for a while. Trae Young is another one. Zach LaVine is another one. Karl Towns is another one. In this current environment where everything is kind of jammed up from a salary standpoint because things were flat for a few years because of COVID and everything else that went on, there's a lot of salaries that outgrew where the cap was going. Well, now going forward, cap's going to start going up 10% a year. That'll start to change. Things will start to loosen up and we'll see some more moves. But I think that's part of why we're having trouble, or the Pelicans are maybe having some trouble finding an easy trade to make with Ingram, because if you get up $35-36 million in salary, you start making trades to other teams. All these teams are trying to avoid not getting hard capped. If you take in more money than you send out, you automatically are hard capped. It's all the stuff we've been talking about a lot. I know it's minutia. I know it sometimes is boring, but it's the reason why we're seeing teams struggling to make trades. There's been a lot more limitations added. You really got to mind your P's and Q's. You're making any kind of deal, especially one with a ton of money like this one would be.
Well, and plus, you got to extend them.
On that too.
Okay, before we go, we mentioned earlier Kentavious Caldwell-Pope signing a 3-year, $66 million deal with the Magic. The Magic prioritized this signing. They saw KCP out there, and they went after him, even with Klay Thompson out there, even with Paul George out there. The guy they wanted was KCP. They already have a very good perimeter defense. They need backcourt scoring. That really isn't something that KCP is going to give. But if you've got to beat Boston and you've got to beat New York, going for extra wing defense isn't the worst idea in the world.
Well, they needed shooting too, and the man can shoot the ball.
That's true.
The last couple of years, he was a plus 40% three-point shooter. And so an elite defensive team got better defensively and improved their spacing offensively. I love this signing for a young 47-win team.
And have more salary cap space to use. We'll see what they use it on. KCP is an interesting arrival for the Magic, but the bigger maybe thing in the overall grand scheme is that it's a departure from the Nuggets. The Nuggets
didn't pay attention to his initials. Keep championship players. The Lakers learned the hard way, and the Nuggets are about to too. So
Calvin Booth, their general manager, basically admitted this was probably coming after the draft, and basically announced without too much being unclear that Christian Brown, their first-round draft pick from 2 years ago, is probably going to just be promoted into KCP's spot. Now, they are dealing with apron issues. They are facing, wanting to stay out of that second apron with the amount of money that they owe to Jokic and potentially Jamal Murray. Although can I just point out real quick? Jamal Murray is playing for Team Canada right now. They've had 3 or 4 days of practice, and he has not extended his contract. He is eligible for a 4-year, $207 or $8 million extension. He obviously could wait and to see if he makes the All-NBA team next year and get a Supermax. But for a guy who's got a history of knee injuries, he's out there playing without the contract. So I don't know if that's his decision or what, but I just want to point that out. But anyway, they lost. They won the championship. They lost Bruce Brown. Basically, couldn't afford to pay him. We talked about this in the last pod. Now they've lost KCP. They could afford to pay him and elected not to, essentially because of the apron problems.
Well, they elected not to because the Kroenkes cheaped out. I mean, this is not the Clippers situation.
It can
Clippers
be,
had it.
It can be
Well,
whatever. They lost him because they weren't willing, whether it was because of the second apron and all the ramifications, or because the Kroenkes cheaped out, they weren't willing to give the man who helped them win a championship and was a critical part of the best starting five in the league last couple of years, a reasonable raise. And if we want to talk about if this is a second apron thing, dude, the one massive mistake that Calvin Booth has made as a general manager, why is Zeke Naji on a 4-year, $32 million deal, a guy who only played garbage time during the playoffs, and a deal that descends so the number is higher in the first year? If they don't have that contract in the books, there's not this second apron problem that's causing them to let KCP go.
It would still be a problem, but this is really the crux of the issue, which is if you go back over the past several years, Denver has made, in my opinion, multiple mistakes on contracts. They gave Michael Porter Jr. a max when he had a bunch of injury issues. Everybody at the time was like, that's interesting. Gave him a full max. He's probably a $25 million player. He's making $40 million. That $15 million matters a heck of a lot more than the Zeke Naji money. I mean, look, Jamal Murray obviously won them a title. He's a great player. They gave him a max without any negotiation. He's never made an all-star team. He is the most confounding player in the league to me. We've talked about this before because he has these unbelievable moments in the playoffs, and he's never really come close to making an all-star team. But if they had negotiated that a little bit harder, say they give him $5 million a year less, now you're at $20 million between those two guys. That's what Kentavious Caldwell-Pope just left for. This is the new reality that we're living in, where if you overpay somebody, there are ripple effects down the line from a team building perspective that you can't get past. But to me, this is very simple. The Nuggets had a team that was the favorite all last year to win. They blew a game 7 at home and lost. They were up 20 in the second half. They win that game. A very good chance they win the title. This is a team where if you're not going to spend into the second apron to keep this team together, you're never going to do it. So I don't want to hear about, we're challenged by the new reality of this. Is very simple. The Kroenkes, who have rarely played the tax, despite having a ton of money, clearly chose not to pay the tax. Because this isn't about they wouldn't have players on their team. They've been drafting all these young guys to fill in the gaps. This is, they didn't want to spend that much money and pay the heavy luxury tax that comes with it. So they didn't. And as a result, they significantly took a step back in a loaded Western Conference.
Caldwell-Pope is 32. I don't know how that much fit. They may not have. They may have been
a 2-year deal with a player option. It wasn't a 5-year contract.
It's a 3-year deal. It's a 3-year deal. You have to assume
it's a 3-year deal, and they're right now. They've got arguably the best player on the planet, if not still the best player, probably the best player, Nikola Jokic. Yeah. And they got a team that if they had re-signed him, would have gone to the next season as one of the 2 or 3 favorites to win the title. Now they're clearly not one of the, to me, 5 best teams in the league.
Oh, come on. They didn't drop that
far
off.
They have to deal with. They already were dead last in 3-point attempts in the league and 25th in makes per game last year. And that's with, as MacMahon points out, losing a 40% 3-point shooter that they're replacing with Christian Brown.
Well, they're supposedly going to trade for Russell Westbrook, so that'll solve that.
And he'll fill right in for KCP, guarding all these elite players that he'll guard. I mean, Anthony Edwards, he'll guard Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, he'll guard Luka Doncic, Devin Booker. We can go on down the list.
Look, this is a huge loss for Denver.
We cannot minimize the loss of KCP. And 2 years ago, in Calvin Booth's first months in this job, he went out and got 2 finishing pieces that got them a championship. Got Bruce Brown, got KCP. Because of the way they were able to get Bruce Brown, there was nothing possible they could do to prevent him from leaving. He just played himself into too much money. This was preventable. They decided that KCP wasn't worth the money and what the money was going to mean in terms of the second apron, luxury tax, and all that kind of stuff. This, to me, takes the Nuggets from being top shelf contenders in the Western Conference to the second tier of, hey, they still got Joker. They're going to have a chance, but they're not better than Dallas. They're not better than OKC. Just to name who the two that I don't think they're better than Minnesota.
Minnesota either.
Yeah.
No, like this guy's yes, he's 32. He's also still a really good 3-and-D player. They have no replacement for him on the roster. They have no shooting as it is, and they lost him because they chose not to pay him.
And if you're not going all out to put a contender around a 3-time MVP in the middle of his prime,
when are you doing it?
What?
It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. To me, this is way more inexcusable than, like, everybody's freaking out about what the Clippers did with Paul George. To me, this is way more inexcusable than the Clippers not giving Paul George a max. Way more.
By the way, I don't think people are freaking out about it. I think they just are surprised because it's a move that has not been seen.
I'm going to hear a lot more people saying, why didn't the Clippers give Paul George a max? I'm not going to hear nearly as many people say, why didn't the Nuggets match the KCP, though? And this is a way bigger mistake by a team to do.
There are a couple. One, Paul George is an all-NBA player, so there's going to be a different sort of spotlight. Two,
of course,
what they gave up for Paul George,
of course,
to get him, and still hasn't been fully paid off. So
I understand that. But my point is, I can understand why the Clippers would look at their team, like we talked about earlier, and say, this team isn't good enough to win, so we're not going to give ourselves all these restrictions to get better when we can't be good enough now. Well, the Nuggets are good enough now, and they actively made themselves worse just to save money.
I agree. And the thing, hey, Christian Brown, he's one of the best net rating guys in the league. Plug him in the starting lineup and be fine. Okay, your bench has been bad. And, you've had to overcome a bad bench for the last couple of years. Now you're taking the best player from that bench, plugging him in the starting lineup. And look, maybe Julian Strather, a guy who showed some flashes last year as a rookie, maybe he's ready to step in to a significant role.
They traded up in this draft to get their guy in this draft. They traded up from like 27th, Deron Holmes.
Yeah. And, I don't know, maybe Russ comes in there and, if that trade ends up happening, it gives some juice to the second unit. But KCP was a perfect fit with that starting five. They're losing their best perimeter defender and a guy who spaced the floor and, helped keep that offense humming.
And always played.
Huge blow. Always
played. I mean, look, this is a huge bet by Calvin Booth, and I think as much ownership, but certainly Calvin Booth, who's talked a lot about all these young guys that they've accrued to have on the bench, of having those guys play. They're going to have to play because they don't have a lot of other choices now. And I think Christian Brown's a solid player. This isn't that saying he stinks, but like you said, MacMahon, in the playoffs, they were playing 6 guys. They're playing the 5 starters and this guy.
I like him as your 7th man. I don't like him as your shooting guard.
And now he's stepping into the starting lineup and he doesn't shoot. We probably haven't talked about the Atlanta part of it enough because the Magic did make a nice run last year, make the playoffs. And I do like the fit of him with them, given another team that didn't have any shooting, a veteran presence who will shoot the ball. But
they're not done yet.
No, they're not. They have more money to spend, like you talked about earlier. But it's just really frustrating to see a team as good as Denver that had this group that fit together as well as it did, that has an ownership group that can certainly afford to pay the luxury tax at whatever number it is, just choose not to pay it from a spending standpoint. And that's it. Because there's really no other reason to justify not keeping this guy.
I mean, are the Celtics over the second apron?
Yes.
Yeah, because they're a championship
way over
team, and they know they're a championship team, so they're willing to, deal with that to keep a championship team together. This was a proven championship team.
The Nuggets ownership is deeper pocketed than the Celtics ownership.
If by a lot.
Not to count other people's money, but
the point is they have the money to do it, and they chose not to. And maybe it'll end up being a good bet. Maybe we'll be sitting here a year from now, they'll have won the title, and they'll make us all look silly. But
we'll see if what they do in the next couple of days. And by the way, we'll be back with another pod that we'll record on Monday night that'll post on Tuesday because we're expecting some things, a lot more things to get done on Monday as well. Once so many frontline pieces fall into place, a lot more trades I think are going to be happening as well after all these signings. Okay. Thank you to our producers, Jackson and Adrian. Thank you to MacMahon and Bontemps. Thank you for listening to the Hoop Collective podcast. We'll talk to you soon.
Adios, amigos.